Au bord du précipice, Monaco est tout près de la descente en Ligue 2. 18e est actuellement relégable, les Monégasques doivent l'emporter face à Lyon pour être sûrs de...
At the beginning of the last decade, AS Monaco found themselves dropping down into Ligue 2, a once great French club, now beleaguered in the second division.
Mark looking into the target, Bakayoko! Monaco back in front of the away goals!
By the end of the decade though, they had made their way back, winning the First Division title and taking an exciting team packed with starlets to the Champions League semi-final in 2017.
Monaco searching for a new manager after they decided to part ways with Leonardo Jardim this week. The club sitting in the drop zone in Ligue with one win this season. They are winless in 10 in all competitions.
But once again, the wheels of time have turned against them.
Thierry Henry is gone. Henry sacked as Monaco manager. Do you think it's a bit hard since he's only been there for 15 weeks and they basically sold their whole team recently?
Monaco are back in decline.
They officially announced that they have sacked their manager Leonardo Jardim for the second time in 14 months.
In this episode, we ask, what has gone wrong for Monaco? And what does the future look like for them?
I think in terms of their squad, they should be a lot higher than 7th. If you look on paper across Ligue and the different squads, theirs is probably at least 4th best.
Adam White is chief features writer at Get French Football News, Football Radar's senior Ligue 1 analyst, and covers French football for The Guardian.
PSG are a long way clear, but Lyon and Marseille are both pretty strong at the moment. But if you look at Wassim Ben Yedder, Islam Samani's done really well since he came in, Cesc Fabregas, Alexander Golovin. Monaco have a very, very good squad on paper at the moment. It's just finding the right formula and challenging those teams at the top. So 7th is a little bit below par, but there are a lot of caveats to that answer, of course.
So let's go back to the beginning of the season. Leonardo Jardim, the manager who Monaco had so much success with only a couple of years ago, is back at the club, having rejoined them in January after Thierry Henry's brief stint at the club. Thierry Henry had taken over from Jardim himself only a year earlier. So what's happened in the intervening period?
Well, Henry was a disaster, quite frankly. There are a lot of caveats to Henry's poor management of Monaco. He used nearly 50 players during his tenure due to injuries were horrendous. He had long-term injuries to a number of players and really struggled and was forced to bring in a lot of youth players, a lot of young players. And although he managed that situation badly is a big caveat to their poor form. There was one defeat to Metz, I seem to remember really well. They played a cup game against Metz, who were winning Ligue 2 at that point, and they put out a weakened team. Monaco had a strong team out and they lost at home 3-1. And I think Henry wasn't prepared for management. His demeanour was weird on the touchline. He'd be quite immature. He'd insult opposition players. There was a report of him insulting someone's grandmother, opposition player's grandmother. I remember him mouthing "wow" almost at a camera when one of his players got injured. He was sort of very indecisive and very obviously very frustrated. He didn't handle the pressure particularly well. That sort of characterised his tenure at the club.
Talk to us about this flip-flopping backwards and forwards between Jardim, Henry, and then back to Jardim again. How could the owner, Dmitry Rybolyev, possibly justify this timeline? We'll go on to talk about Rybolyev later, but Jardim had been removed because Rybolyev didn't feel as though he was putting in the right sort of performances in the 2018-19 season, and now, a season later, you've got Jardim back again.
Yeah, it's an absolutely incredible turnaround. I remember this news coming out and I was absolutely amazed. I think Rybolyev just admitted he was wrong, quite frankly. He just said the Henry situation went absolutely disastrously and the things that went wrong previously or were going wrong or perceived to be going wrong under Jardim in his previous tenure weren't seen as affecting as they might have been. And he admitted that sacking him for those reasons was wrong. And Jardim actually returned with a lot more power than he left with, bizarrely. He was still around Monaco. There was talks of him sort of running into players around Monaco, still living there. I think he just sort of admitted that he'd made a mistake and said, come back, I was wrong, you can have all everything that you wanted before in terms of player recruitment and you were the future of the club, basically. I was wrong in sacking you. So it's weird that the flip-flopping situation, but in Rybolyev's head, not being a football man, if you like, in sort of general terms, being a businessman first and foremost, it made sense to him because it worked before, I've changed it doesn't work, so I'm going to go back to the thing that did make it work.
Let's go back to the beginning of this season then. After just about steadying the ship last season, I think they finished 17th. Jardim has a summer to prepare for the new season. Do you think there were any warning signs apparent at that point that things might not go well this season?
Yeah, I think so. When he returned initially, they had a very good run, and then, as you mentioned, they sort of slipped back towards the relegation zone, and it really felt like the new manager bounced, that the players weren't happy with the way Henry managed them. That wore off very quickly, and the same issues returned. I think the most difficult issue that he dealt with, and that they dealt with this season, and the warning signs, if you like, coming into this season, was as simple as saying that the team wasn't the 2017 team, and the way that they structured their policy and the way they went about recruiting players and building a team was open to dips and open to periods where they were going to struggle, and they sort of refused to accept that. And you could argue that this was one of those, but that wasn't really accepted by the club. So Jardim was always kind of on a little bit of a short leash, despite the fact that they were going to be sort of undulating in terms of form and in terms of success anyway. And this season there were a lot of disagreements with the team over what formation they were playing. That sort of started at the end of last season. So I would argue, yes, absolutely. I'm very lucky, honestly, to stay up at one stage. It looked like, I think they would have got sacked under Henry, but Jardim was still pretty fortunate to keep them in the division. So yeah, I think it sort of led into this season a little bit and the poor start they had.
Yeah, and you mentioned that poor start. They start off with a couple of losses to open their Ligue account, and then there's no win until game week 7. So what were the issues on the field for Monaco?
Well, firstly, they were still searching for that right formula, and there was a disagreement between the players and Jardim over what formation they would play. Jardim very rarely has played 3 centre-backs, despite being a very adaptable coach and someone who will get the best out of the resources that he has and play to his strengths. Monaco's team that won the league played this brilliant 4-2-4 almost, very attacking, scored lots of goals. But he's also had seasons where Monaco finished 2nd or 3rd in Ligue, and before that where they were very boring and very defensive, very pragmatic team. The players felt that a 3-5-2 suited their setup, and there were various disagreements over that. Playing 4 at the back hasn't worked. The biggest downturn since that 2017 title win has been their 2 centre-backs, and Kamil Glik and Jemison. A lot of Monaco's issues on the field come from simply their absolutely terrible form since that. They've completely dropped off a cliff, and both players have been nowhere near their best since then. But I think that start to the campaign could also be characterised by new players coming in. You've got Wassim Ben Yedder, Ismail Samani, Bakayoko return, Adrian Silva, all just joined or were joining as the season got underway, and they perhaps weren't entirely fit, and they were struggling to gel as a unit. Though most of them joined after the first game. So the disagreement over what the best formation was and the new players bedding in was probably the main reasons for that poor start.
Having said that, it's not entirely clear that Monaco have had a disastrous season so far. Taking a look through the Guardian pieces that you put out, the headlines seem to oscillate a bit from
Monaco have lost sight of everything that made them Ligue and champions
at the beginning of the season to
have Monaco suddenly found a winning formula
only a couple of months ago. What were the positives that had you praising Monaco in September?
Well, I think it was simply that they did switch formation and they did sort of find a new way to win. You mentioned those 2 headlines and the difference between them. I think the first one, they lost sight of everything that made them League and Champions, and that sort of formula that made them League and Champions was one way to win, a way they sort of almost stumbled across a little bit. And it went beyond the playing staff. It went up to Vadim Vasiliev and the recruitment, the fantastic recruitment policy and the way they scouted and developed and produced and sold young players. That was one way to win the league and win games. And they completely lost sight of that and flip-flopped between various other sort of ideas about how they go about producing their team and recruiting players. They've gone all the way down to spending 20 million on 16-year-olds, jumping the shark to some extent in youth development, and then they've almost gone in completely the other direction now, focusing on older players. So they kind of moved on and lost sight of what made them great to start with, but you could argue that they found a new formula in signing those older players. Ben Yedder's been brilliant, Slimani's been brilliant, and moving to that 3-5-2. So, as you mentioned, they didn't win until game week 7, but then they won 8 of the next 12. So obviously there are a million ways to win games, and they just simply moved from one to the other.
J'ai à la gratitude sur cet club, sur cet dirigeant qui, à 4 ans, fait un pari moi pour faire du sporting pour Monaco.
Given that you were so positive in September, how surprised were you when Jardim was sacked last week?
It was pretty amazing, to be honest. I think, as I said, Jardim is a very adaptable coach, and he's often been a coach that has been under pressure in the past. You don't really think about it given that brilliant 2017 title win with Kylian Mbappe and Radamel Falcao on form. But he has been in tight spots before at Monaco, and he has proven at being able to cajole his squad into finding a way to win. As I mentioned, they've been attacking, they've been defensive, and he's found a way to get results. And as I mentioned as well, that the start season wasn't exactly the most ideal in terms of players coming in. But as I also mentioned, they'd won 8 of the last 12. He won his last game 5-1 against Lille. So it was a huge shock really to see him go. But I think there are probably factors that we aren't considering other than results. And there was a meeting between the hierarchy and Jardim over Christmas, and in that meeting it was decided that he would move on. So sacking isn't necessarily the right phrasing. I think that sort of midway season point was meeting and sort of status update on how the team were doing and where they thought the team were going was always planned, and they probably weren't going to sack him before then, or they weren't going to part company with him before then. And for whatever reason, they've decided that the team, perhaps in Jardim's opinion, the team aren't necessarily gelling as he would like. They are 7th in the league, which still isn't great. I would argue that there are probably factors beyond the immediate results for that. But even so, football is about results. And you'd have to imagine that beating Lille 5-1, brilliantly so, second last year, fantastic, obviously struggling with the Champions League, but still, brilliant result, 8 wins in 12, very good as well. Compared to what it was like last season, that is very, very good form. And it was a huge surprise, yes. But as I said, I imagine it's to do with factors beyond the pitch.
It is fair to say 2019 was a turbulent, testing and triumphant year for Robert Moreno, although not always in that order. Unfortunately, Moreno will be remembered for his ousting after 9 games unbeaten as Spain manager, making way for Luis Enrique to resume the post. Yet Moreno has quickly moved on to become Monaco manager, his first job as a club boss.
The new manager, Robert Moreno, is largely unproven despite having a fairly successful stint as Spain manager overseeing a qualification to Euro 2020. Do you think this appointment is a stroke of genius, or is it possibly another mistake?
I think it's one of those situations where only sort of time will tell. I think he fits the bill, at least at first glance. He's very good at developing young players, which traditionally Monaco also very good at. But you could argue they've moved quite a fair bit away from developing young players in the previous regime that sort of brought in young players and scouted so fantastically. Speaks very good French, which is a huge plus, something that other managers have struggled with in the past, and not just in France, but across the continent. I think it's a huge barrier not being able to speak the language. I think Gary Neville at Valencia might have been the biggest example of that in recent times. He's clearly a very, very good coach, and he's a more experienced coach than Henry as well. Henry was Belgium assistant manager for a while and came in completely unprepared. But Moreno has been around Spain for a long time. As you mentioned, he coached Spain during Luis Enrique's absence and has been assistant coach all over the place at Barcelona, at Celta Vigo, and comes across very well. Much like Mikel Arteta did at his first Arsenal press conference, he came across very intelligently and spoke a lot more precisely about the way he wanted to go about things. So he fits the bill there, but he's just so inexperienced in sort of as a head coach that it's definitely a gamble, basically, but he fits the bill.
So that's how Monaco's season has gone so far. But how does it fit within the broader tapestry of their recent history? In order to answer that question, we'll need to go back 10 years. It's 2011. Monaco have dropped down a division into Ligue 2. They're still struggling on the pitch, and off the pitch their debts are mounting. A Russian oligarch, Dmitry Rybolyev, buys the club for €1 with the promise of spending €100 million to rebuild the side. How immediate was Rybolyev's takeover in realising its ambition of saving the club?
I think it depends on your criteria for what constitutes saving the club. When he took over, they were bottom of Ligue 2, which is pretty disastrous. They were relegated the season before with 42 points, and they went into the final day of the season with 5 or 6 teams that could have gone down. It was an extremely close relegation battle, and I don't think they'd been in the relegation zone until that point, and they dropped into 18th on the last day and went down. A lot of the players left, and they were bottom of Ligue 2. They finished 9th when he took over at the midway point of that season. It wasn't like they were immediately promoted back. They got Claudio Ranieri in and won Ligue 2 the next season, and then finished second in Ligue in the season after that as a promoted team. So it wasn't immediate, but it was still a pretty steep upward curve.
After having adopted an approach that threw money at the problem, in 2014 Monaco adopted a different tactic. I've got a quote here from then Vice President Vadim Vasiliev.
There are 2 ways to go. One is either you invest a lot of money and do it quickly, The other is to build up an intelligent project, and you have to base yourself on your academy and sound principles of working and scouting well, and basically, that's what we've decided to do.
I think this is a really interesting sort of footballing philosophical debate about Monaco and how they go about producing their team and developing young players. I think first you can have to look at why they made that switch. Vasiliev was always adamant that it was a pre-planned thing, that they'd bring in, they spend loads of money on James Rodriguez, Radamel Falcao and a few others, and to sort of get them off the ground, if you like, as a force in Ligue. But the reason for the switch, although it was extremely successful in the end, is a little bit murkier. Ryboliev is supposedly very upset about FFP and having to pay sort of FFP fines. There's also some reports that perhaps the money wasn't there to continue that sort of PSG-style project. When you look at QSI, who own PSG, they're sort of worth over $300 billion, according to Forbes relatively recently. So that is serious spending power, and that's probably outweighs even Ryboliev's sort of reach, if you like. So there's a few sort of background reasons to why they switched, which is quite interesting. But overall, it went extremely well. They switched to having some very targeted scouting. You look at players like Fabinho, who was signed initially on loan from Portugal, signed for a very low fee, and became their leader, and Falcao was captain, of course, but their sort of midfield general, and sold to Liverpool for a massive amount of money by comparison. And they were so good at scouting those younger players, bringing them in and developing them, but they had the perfect setup for that. Luis Campos is another name that was crucial to that. Perhaps the best sporting director in Europe, as I mentioned previously. He was in charge of their recruitment, but left before the 2017 title win. But a lot of the players that were signed and key to that title win were already sort of in the works or already at the club. Vasiliev as well, very good at negotiating big fees for players that left. Players like Benjamin Mendy got more than 50 million for. There was 51 million. I think he might have said to Manchester City that you paid 50 million for Kyle Walker and he's better, so give us an extra 1 million, which is classic Vasiliev. It went perfect. They made a lot of money in transfer sales, and it meant that they were successful as well. And you look at players who came through and the players around Europe who were at Monaco at one stage, and that's sort of proof of how successful it was.
Well, it was set up for a party at the Stade Louis II, as at least a point against Saint-Étienne would officially confirm Monaco as champions. 18-year-old Mbappe with his 26th in all competitions, 20 of those in 2017 alone, and that helping to allow Falcao to lift the Ligue 1 title aloft as Monaco became champions of France for the first time in 17 years.
If the low point of the decade was 2011, the high point was 2017, that Champions League semi-final. Talk us through that season.
It was absolutely brilliant watching it. I've covered French football for a number of years now in extreme detail, and it was easily the most exciting season I've covered, and I would argue that Monaco team were the most exciting team of the last decade, aside from Barcelona, the Guardiola Barcelona. I think they would be keeping them honest in second place, and that's when you think about the Leicester season in the Premier League, the Borussia Dortmund team under Jurgen Klopp. They were absolutely fantastic. They were averaging 3 goals a game in all competitions at one point, lasted for much of the season. They played this iconic kind of 4-2-4, 4-4-2 formation. Falcao and Mbappe, Valjean started, and the season but eventually was phased out. And then the midfield of Lamar, Bakayoko, Fabinho, and Bernardo Silva, who of course is tearing up in Manchester City now. And it was just brilliant to watch. They're extremely exciting, extremely attacking, not necessarily gung-ho. They were sort of intelligent in the way they went about games, but games against sort of Manchester City with that 5-3, they actually lost that game 5-3, but won the second leg 3-1 and went through. Just showed their potency in front of the goal and how exciting and how sort of attack-minded they were. It was brilliant to watch, and that Champions League semi-final kind of underlines how good they were, and that PSG have not reached the Champions League semi-final since QSI took over. Monaco, developing younger players, signing younger players and bringing them on, go and better them in sort of one fell swoop, if you like, which is a bit of a humiliation for PSG.
So by the end of the season, Monaco have got a team that's just absolutely stacked with young talent. And obviously Europe is well aware of this fact. They've played well in the Champions League. And so they're essentially sitting there as a shot window to the rest of the big European clubs. Obviously, since that point, those players have slowly moved on to some of the biggest clubs around Europe. Did that success, both on the field and then in terms of the economics of the club, did that change the club immediately?
I think it did, but only because in a number of ways. Firstly, in that their policy dictates that it would change the club. The way they worked was sort of in cycles, and they'd sign a group of younger players, they'd develop those players on with the help of some experienced professionals like Kamil Glickas and Radamel Falcao. And when they achieved something, noteworthy that, as you said, kind of got them in the shop window, so to speak, then they would cash in and sell these players on. And it happened once before at the end of the previous cycle when they reached the Champions League quarterfinals. In 2015, players like Anthony Martial went for big money to Manchester United, Jeffrey Kondogbia, Yannick Ferrer Carrasco, and a few others left, and they started again. And this title win was sort of the culmination of another cycle when Mbappe went to PSG for 180 million euros, eventually after a year's loan. That front six that I just talked about, all of them left apart from Falcao pretty much. Lamar and Fabinho were left for that next season, but they both wanted to leave too. Fabinho was very close to PSG, and Lamar had a very poor season after they won the league, was injured and in and out of the team. In more general terms, it changed the club in terms of their recruitment policy. I think they kind of lost sight a little bit of what had made that last group successful, and they kind of doubled down on youth, and they kind of said, well, it's youth players that we're bringing in for a cheap fee. Like Lamar cost 4 million, they sold him for 80 to Atletico Madrid, of course, but he was still an established Ligue 1 player, young, yes, but he was the perfect example of a player developing in Ligue 1, which sort of happens all the time. There are a lot of younger players at the lower down the league. Was at Caen at the time. He was sort of the symbol of the type of player they were signing, but they ended up signing two 16-year-olds for 20 million each, Pietro Pellegrini from Genoa and William Goebbels, who we haven't really seen at all, from Lyon, who was supposedly the next big thing. And they were spending all this money on players that weren't ready for the first team, that were a long way from developing into players even like Lamar. In that aspect, it changed the club and adversely, because they jumped the shark a little bit on their transfer policy.
You've already mentioned that the original impetus behind the intelligent project, quote unquote, was a concern about FFP rules. Obviously, with that influx of money, those concerns have presumably now gone. Do you think that the owners at Monaco now consider themselves too successful for this original intelligent project?
I think that's an interesting question, an interesting way to look at it. I'd argue probably not. I would argue, like as we just discussed, the change in tact and the way they've gone about their business since suggests a slight misunderstanding of what made them successful initially, and that it was that signing of established players and in Ligue 1, but young, yes, and ready to develop, yes, but still capable of slotting into a first team at the top of the table. So it was just a little bit rash to change the way they went about their business, and I think that the loss of Luis Campos is pretty big, and Vasiliev went obviously initially under Henry, so the change in hierarchy is also a factor. So I think it was just a sort of a misunderstanding of what made them so good, and trying to evolve when they didn't need to evolve. So I'd argue they kind of shot themselves in the foot a little bit.
So what does the future hold for Monaco, do you think?
Well, it's effectively a new club when you think about it. We sort of talked a lot about their title-winning campaign, and you look above the playing staff. Jardim's now gone, Vasiliev's gone, Campos has gone. The team is entirely different now. Kamil Glik is pretty much the only survivor from that 2017 team. They've completely changed their sort of policy on youth development and signing younger players and bringing them on. They've almost switched towards the PSG model again, bizarrely, but in a Marseille kind of way. Marseille are kind of, in France, a little bit derided for something they call the Champions Project, which is basically like a PSG sort of tribute act, and they try and sign big names of experience, but obviously don't have the resources, and they sign people like Adil Rami and Luis Gustavo and Florent Thauvin, Dimitri Payet. Monaco are kind of doing that now, and it did not work for Marseille at all. It was actually pretty disastrous for Marseille, and they've also kind of changed their policy a little bit. So it kind of feels like they've moved towards this entirely different philosophy, and so it's obviously the same club, but it feels like an effectively new project. I think it all depends on Moreno, and at the end of the day, Monaco aren't the biggest club in European terms. They've averaged the lowest attendance in Ligue 1 in recent seasons, and they're often a club that are famed for being sort of a developer of youth players and a local talent. It depends how this new philosophy gels with that new hierarchy that have come in, away from the genius of Campos and Vasiliev and Jardim. And there's a lot of moving parts that need to succeed and work together for them to come anywhere near that 2017 form.
Adam White is Chief Features Writer at Get French Football News, Football Radar's senior Ligue 1 analyst, and covers French football for The Guardian. This episode was produced by Josh Schneider-Weiler. I'm John Mackenzie. Thanks for listening to Football Today. If you enjoyed this podcast, why not rate and review it on iTunes? Or maybe share an episode with a friend. See you next time.